Welcome to video lesson 5.2, where I'm going to be introducing to you this idea of absolute value. So it's an important concept. I'm going to do a little bit of just teaching before we get to the notes, but you are going to need to fill in your table of contents. And I gave you 2 purple pages in class today, 55, 56. Fill that in. It's absolute value, and I'm also going to be talking about opposites today. So again, this is just a little intro. You can just watch and follow along and learn about this topic of what absolute value is. So very simply put, absolute value is the distance a number is away from 0. You can see this number line here. It's all nice and colorful. And I have a dot here at 4. And you can see that it is 4 units away from 0. So we could call the absolute value of 4, 4. When we're dealing with negative numbers, we still want to know how far away that negative number is from 0. And so you can see the green dot at a green dot at -3, and it is 3 spaces or 3 units away from 0. So absolute value, distance away from 0. So the big thing here, a little animation here for you. Ooh, it's getting bigger. The big idea here is that absolute value is always a positive number because it's talking about distance away from something. So here's 0, and how far away is that number? Whether it's negative or positive, you're measuring distance. So how many feet is it from your house to the store? Or how many miles is it from your house to your grandmother's house? So distance, that idea of how far away something is always going to be a positive number. So that's the biggest thing to remember when you're talking about absolute value. The answers, when you're dealing with absolute value, are always positive because of this idea. So here's another just example with a number line. We have the number 4, it's a little bit bigger, and we want to know what is this distance away from 0. We have 4 units, so the absolute value is 4. And you're starting to see this in my pictures as well. We're going to talk about what this is. This is called notation, or a symbol of absolute value, and there are 2 vertical lines. We're going to fill that in our notes in just a second. I have another one here with the negative side of absolute value. If you have a number like -5, how far away from 0 is -5? You just count the spaces, and the distance or absolute value is 5 units. So now we're in our purple notes. All you have to do is trim them down and put them on these 2 pages like so, and we're going to start filling these in now. So like I said, absolute value is the distance away from 0. So the absolute value of an integer, of any positive, 0, or negative number, is its distance from 0 on the number line. Does not matter which direction from 0. It can be on the negative side or the positive side. The notation, that's what I mentioned before, or the symbol, or how do we know we're actually finding absolute value, is 2 lines on either side of whatever number you have. And I'm going to symbolize the number with this letter N. We can put a 5 in there, we could put 100 in there, we could put 1,000,000,000 in there and find the absolute value of that number. We can do this negative billion as well. And whenever you see those 2 vertical lines on either side of the number, or you'll sometimes see 2 numbers in there, we have to find the absolute value of whatever is inside. So, fill that in. Move my screen down. So you have something very similar to this. The only difference between yours and mine is up here I have properties as well as characteristics and facts, but we're going to fill this in to just give us some other ways of talking about the definition and some examples. So Another way to talk about what the definition of absolute value is to literally say how far away a number is from 0. So that's what we're going to also write here. How far away a number is from 0. Again, getting at that distance. How far away, that's distance from 0. What does it look like? Well, when I was talking about distance, I mentioned that distance is always positive. So when we're talking about absolute value, our answers are always going to be positive. So, and what does it look like? That's the other thing we're going to put in here. So it looks like that number line that we were seeing before. So I'm just going to do a very simple one with, and again, a number line is just, this has 2 arrows on it because it goes forever in the left direction and forever in the right direction. But we're only going to take a little sample of that number line and just deal with -1 to +2 to show you that the absolute value of 2 is going to be 2. We could also do -1, and that's a distance of 1. So now let's do some examples. So we're done with the first 2 boxes. Some examples could be any number we really want. I'm going to start with -7. And the distance that number is away from 0 is going to be its positive value. The other thing that we need to make sure we understand is that we could have a decimal that we're finding the absolute value of. It doesn't have to be a whole number. And that, again, is just the positive value of whatever is inside. And since this is positive, it's also talking about the positive value. So that's another example. And finally, we could do just the other direction of this. 7 would also be a positive 7 as our absolute value answer. Some non-examples are any negative number that you might see. So you might see -2, you might see -0.5, or a decimal like 0.3 that's negative. So any negative number, you know automatically you're not dealing with absolute value if this is an answer. Can't be an absolute value. So now you have a section at the bottom of that first purple page that's asking you to find absolute values. So now this is where we're going to practice finding the absolute value. You can go ahead and try all of these, pause and try them on your own, and then resume once you have answers and you can check them with me. Hopefully you did not have a problem figuring these out. You can always draw a number line. However, when the numbers get bigger, it might be more problematic to draw that, to try to see and count, but it's always the positive value of whatever number is inside when there is only one number. So -23, the absolute value is 23. 10 is 10, the absolute value of 20 is 20, and the absolute value of -9, 9. The absolute value of -119 is 119. -13, its absolute value is 13. I left this one blank on purpose. When you're dealing with distance and you are at 0, the absolute value can be 0. So that one was, I think, the trickiest one of the bunch. Absolute value of 17, 17, and absolute value of 223, 223. We will see absolute value problems where there might be 2 numbers. I know this isn't in your examples, but if that's ever the case, we have to add what's inside and then take the absolute value of that. So the second topic that I'm going to share and teach you is all about opposites. And opposites are really fun, and I'm going to kind of be running around back and forth here to make my point even more clear. So the opposite of a number, you don't have to fill anything in, but I do want you to box the important things here in this definition that's in this box. So the opposite of a number is the number that occupies, and I want you to put a box around what I've underlined. It's a number that occupies the same spot, these box that, on a number line, but in the opposite direction. So an example, the opposite of 10 is negative 10. So you're going to start over here, and then the same spot on the number line will be 10 spaces in the opposite direction from 0. So 0 is important. I'm here at 0. 10 spots this way, I have to go 10 spots in the opposite direction, okay? So we'll have some fun with this tomorrow with actually you doing this with my giant number line as well. The last thing I need to talk about before we do some examples is how do we show, or the notation that we're trying to find an opposite. And so that's the notation or the symbol that tells you, oh, I got to take the opposite of that number without the direction saying, oh, take the opposite of the number, is this negative symbol that's on the outside of a number, and they will have that number in parentheses. So you will see a number in parentheses with a negative symbol on the outside. That means take the opposite of whatever is inside the parenthesis. Now we're going to try some examples. This is literally just the example that the directions say find the opposite of these numbers. So there's no notation. I'll show you what that notation would look like though. So the notation would be that negative 20. Sorry, that 20 with the negative sign on the outside of the parentheses. Since we have those directions, we can just find the opposite of 20. So picture yourself at 0. You have 20 in the positive direction. You need to go 20 in the opposite direction, which is negative. So our opposite is negative 20. If we're at 0 and we're talking about negative 5 in that direction, if we're 0, we have to go opposite direction, which is positive 5. So you'll notice the pattern here. And the opposite of 0 is just 0, just similar to the absolute value. You're already at 0, you can't go in the opposite direction. And the notation, just to see this in a negative number, you will have the negative number inside the parenthesis, and then you'll see this other symbol on the outside of the parenthesis. That tells you, ooh, we're taking the opposite of what's inside. So the last thing we get to talk about is kind of a cool idea, and it is talking about taking the opposite of the opposite, which kind of seems redundant once you get the hang of what it's talking about. So finding the opposite of the opposite is always going to be the same number that you started with, because if we're talking about the opposite of the opposite of 10, you start at 10, and then you find the opposite of 10, which will be negative 10 over here. And then, once you're here at negative 10, you have to find the opposite of this guy, which is right back where you started at 10. So it's a lot of like going back and forth, but finding the opposite of the opposite will give you the number that you actually are starting with. That's really the biggest idea. So the notation is a little bit more complicated because you're taking a number and you're finding the opposite of it. So that's the same. But then we're going to take this whole thing. See how I went parentheses around the whole thing? And then I'm going to go over the is. There's another opposite sign on the outside of it all. So let me do that again. You start with the number and you take the opposite of it. That's what we learned before. Then you take this whole entire thing and you put parentheses around that, and you take the opposite of that. So whenever you see a bunch of opposite symbols or negative symbols going on, with parentheses, you're taking the opposite of the opposite. So here, their directions just say, find the opposite of the opposite. It's not that notation thing. So if we're at 23 positive, I would find the opposite of 23, which is negative 23, and then I'm standing over here at negative 23. I have to go all the way over back where I started, which is 23. If I were to do the notation, it would be 23 with a negative symbol, and then that whole thing would be in parentheses with another opposite symbol. So negative 50, negative 576 will be the opposite of the opposite. You take the opposite of the negative 576 as the positive, and then positive turns back right around to go to the negative. So we have a negative 576. Same with negative 90. We're starting over here on the number line, negative 90. We find the opposite of negative 90 is 90, and then we go right back to where we started. So negative 90, the opposite of the opposite is negative 90. Notation for this is going to be even more complicated. We have the number that we're starting with. We're taking the opposite of it, and then that whole thing, we're going to take the opposite of it. Lovely little negative sides there. Same thing with this one. We're starting with the number. We're taking the opposite of it, and then that whole thing, we're taking the opposite of that. So it's a little redundant. Why on earth do we need to know the opposite of the opposite? It is something that you're going to see later on in your math careers in middle school and high school. So this is just the first taste of opposite notation. So I want you to go ahead and try these. There's a mix between just finding the opposite or finding the opposite of the opposite, and I even threw in some absolute value in there at the end. So go ahead and try all of these, and then I'll go through them. So this one is just find the opposite of 5. So that would be negative 5. The second one in the middle, we're finding the opposite of negative 4. So you just think, okay, we're on negative 4 in the number line, and then we have to go in the opposite direction to positive 4. Here's where we start getting into the opposite of the opposite. So we have the number 31, that's somewhere over here on the right side of the number line. We have to find the opposite, which is over here, negative 31. And then we have to find the opposite of where I'm standing here, negative 1. And that's all the way over 31. This one's a little bit newer because we have the absolute value in here as well as the opposite symbol. So we are finding the absolute value of negative 9 first, which is 9, and then taking the opposite of it. So that would be a negative 9. You also could see the absolute value symbol in parentheses. I didn't have it on this one because sometimes you won't see it, but sometimes they'll throw in the parentheses there. You do the same thing. So it's going to be the absolute value of 62 is 62, and then take the opposite of that, and that will be negative 62. This one, I threw in an absolute value and an opposite of the opposite symbol. So we need to first go into the parenthesis and do what's in the center of that parenthesis. So we're going to ignore this opposite symbol. We're going to go right to the absolute value and find out what is the absolute value of negative 24. Well, negative 24 is on the left side of the number line. And then we're going to find the distance that number is away from 0. So that's 24. Notice I'm writing 24 down, so then I can find the opposite of the opposite of 24. And that's just the number that I started with, so I have 24 as my answer. This one, we have two absolute value symbols being added together. So you have to find the absolute value first and then add. So the absolute value of negative 3, how far away is negative 3 from 0 is 3. How far away is 4 from 0? 4, and then add to get 7. This is another one that's similar to this one over here. And we are going to find the absolute value first and then subtract. So notice I want you to write these numbers underneath, not just do it all in your head. That's when careless errors can occur. So absolute value of negative 7, 7. Absolute value of negative 1, 1. 7 minus 1, we have a 6. The last one is a little bit different, even more so because we have two numbers inside the absolute value symbol. When this happens, we have to, like I said briefly before, you have to do whatever the operation is in here first, and then take the absolute value of that. So 16 minus 9, do that first, we have 7, and then take the absolute value and find 7. A couple last things. We're just going to do some boxing and starring and circling. So of these answers that we have now, we want to box the answer above that has the greatest value. So what's the largest or greatest number? And you're going to look at all of these, and I'm finding that 24 is the largest positive value. And then we're going to do the same thing with the least or smallest value. We're going to put a star next to the number of the smallest value. So I'm looking at the negatives, and remember, the negative numbers, as they get farther away from 0, their value gets less and less and less. So we have a negative 62, which is going to be farther away from 0. Therefore, that's the smallest number we have in our list. The last thing, we're going to circle the answer. Get rid of this. Circle the answer that has the lowest absolute value. So here we have to figure out, okay, distance. What number is the closest one on the number line if we were to graph all of them to 0? So I'm looking, and I have, this is a negative number, this is a negative number, but the distance, absolute value, is going to be 4 as our smallest absolute value number. Because if you were to take the absolute value of all of these numbers, they would turn into the positive numbers that they are. 5, 9, 7, 4, 62, 6, 31, 24, and 7. The smallest absolute value answer is going to be 4. So tomorrow we're going to talk about absolute value a little bit more with the number line. You're going to do some interactions and actually stand on number lines and at number lines and show opposite of opposites and absolute value. So I look forward to seeing you then.